let's face it, sooner or later, somebody was bound to identify one of the genes that causes multiple sclerosis. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam, and I've been living with multiple sclerosis for 38 and a half years, and this channel has pretty much been my attempt to research everything I can possibly find about this crazy disease. So I get a lot of news updates on MS because I subscribe to various publications and websites, and just the other day, we finally saw something about genetics. And I am really interested in this because ever since I was diagnosed back in the 80s, the truism was already established that MS is not a simple disease. It requires a genetic component and an environmental trigger. But we aren't really sure what the environmental trigger is, and we absolutely have no idea about the genetic components. So, in other words, they didn't know much. But it does seem like science has advanced. People continue to look carefully at this issue. We found something very interesting, and in combination, what we're finding out about the environmental triggers of MS, we may really be on the road to understanding this strange and frustrating disease. Well, this is the article that I first saw. It was linked from MedPage Today, which is a daily newsletter that I have been receiving. And the headline is pretty exciting. MS disease severity tied to genetic variant. Findings mark a significant breakthrough in understanding how MS progresses. Okay, well, that's interesting. I don't think this one so much tells us then what causes MS as it does once we have MS, how the disease is going to progress. But even so, that's still kind of promising. But you can see it just came out. It was published on June 28th, 2023. The article begins, the first genetic variant associated with faster disease progression in multiple sclerosis has been identified. I like that it's very definitive. It's not might have been identified or is possible. It sounds like it's pretty definite. It says here that in a genome-wide association study, GWAS, and note that acronym because it's going to come up again, of 22,000 people with MS. I love that sample size. That is huge. A significant association between age-related disease severity scores and RS 10191329, which I assume is part of the genetic code, in the DYSF-ZNF638 locus emerged, reported Sergio Berenzini, PhD of the University of California, San Francisco, and co-authors. Despite all the sciencey terms here, it looks like they've got this thing very precisely identified. They say that homozygous carriers of the variant needed a walking aid a median of 3.7 years earlier than non-carriers. And I just want to remind everyone that homozygous means that both your mom and your dad carried this particular variant. Heterozygous would have been that one or the other of the parents did. But since you have both of your parents carrying this variant, it sounds like that adds up to MS later on in life. It says here that the researchers reported in Nature, and in a minute we're going to go over to the Nature paper because that is the actual primary source of this article, and I'm curious to see what they say over there. But let's just look at a couple things here first. These MS patients also showed increased brainstem and cortical pathology in brain tissue, so I guess our MRIs didn't look all that great. The findings mark a significant breakthrough in understanding how MS progresses and suggest central nervous system resilience and reserve may determine the course of the disease. And that is exciting to me. We've been talking about neuroplasticity, and I think that's exactly what they're saying here, that the brain has a certain amount of resilience and reserve capacity that comes into play. And that's the part that we have a great deal of influence over. Though many treatments have been approved for MS relapses, none reliably prevent disability from accumulating. Smoldering inflammation can develop over time, even in patients treated with effective disease-modifying therapies. I like to see that smoldering inflammation. I like to see that the press is now picking this up, that the medical community is now understanding that smoldering MS is a real thing. Smoldering inflammation is what causes the disease to go on regardless of what the MRI show. There's things happening at our cellular level that we won't necessarily detect, but we can certainly see their effects. And here's a quote from Robert Bermel, MD of the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, who wasn't involved with the research. And I think they make that point because if he wasn't involved with the research, it means that he's almost like an unbiased confirmation that this is important research. So that's a good thing. And what he has to say is, we have known for some time that the damage in MS is caused by the immune system, but that the immune system genes and profiles do not necessarily predict disease severity. So what this new research is looking at is what will predict disease severity. And he says this study identifies that pathways and mechanisms in the central nervous system are more closely linked to disease severity and outcome in MS, Bermel told MedPage Today. In particular, the resilience of the nervous system, an ability to recover from damage, may be explained by gene variants within the nervous system itself. Highly encouraging, I think. The variant sits between, okay, now we're going to get sciencey, so if you're not a geneticist or if you don't have a lot of knowledge about genes, you might find this kind of over your head, and I sort of do myself. But let's go ahead. The variant sits between DYSF and ZNF638, two genes with no prior connection to MS. DYSF is involved in repairing damaged cells. Well, that could be relevant to MS. And ZNF638 helps control viral infections. Oh, well, my ears pricked up at that because we've been hearing about how EBV, Epstein-Barr virus, might be the cause of MS. So interesting. So it's not just coincidental that it's located right there. The variant's proximity to these genes suggests that they may be involved in disease progression. The observation via a GWAS study of a significant association between two single nucleotide polymorphisms, that's an SNP or a SNP, by the way. You're going to be seeing that as an acronym in other parts of this article and the other that we're going to look at. So just bear that in mind, single nucleotide polymorphism. And let's go then quickly and just take a look at the definition. What is an SNP? Well, there were lots of different definitions of an SNP, but I decided to go with this one out of Wikipedia. It says that SNP genotyping is the measurement of genetic variations of single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, between members of a species. It is a form of genotyping which is the measurement of more general genetic variation. SNPs are one of the most common types of genetic variation. It's important then to understand that what they're talking about here is not a mutation as such. There's nothing abnormal as such with what happens between one expression of these genes and another. There are basically 4 building blocks of genes in your body, and they are somewhat interchangeable, and that would account for genetic variation between members of the same species. So why you don't look exactly like your brother or your sister is because of these genetic variations. So variation, it's not a mutation. But back on this quote, let's just start that quote over again so we can catch back up with the point of it. The observation via a GWAS study of a significant association between two single nucleotide polymorphisms and MS severity unrelated to disease susceptibility is unsurprising, noted Gavin Giovannoni. Hey, I've talked about him quite a lot, haven't I? Of the Queen Mary University in London, England, who also wasn't involved in the research. Why wouldn't MS severity be affected by genetic factors? So it came as no surprise to him. It says here that ZNF638 encodes a DNA-binding zinc finger protein, Giovannoni pointed out. ZNF638 mediates transcriptional repression of retroviral DNA using chromatin repressors involved in the epigenetic silencing of human endogenous retroviruses, he told MedPage Today. Could this tell us something about one of the mechanisms driving smoldering MS? You know, I love how dots are getting connected here, and I've made a number of videos that refer to Professor Giovannoni's work, and I think that he's probably very encouraged by seeing this latest piece of news because it does support the theories that he's been putting forward about the cause of MS and the progression of MS and smoldering MS, etc. Importantly, ZNF638 is expressed in the brain, particularly in oligodendrocytes and their precursor cells, and is implicated in cognitive ability, Giovannoni added. This work has opened up several new lines of research that will hopefully lead to new therapeutic targets to tackle the major unmet need in MS, smoldering associated worsening independent of focal inflammatory disease activity. And it goes on to say, Barzanini and colleagues studied 12,584 cases and replicated their findings in an additional 9,805 cases. Again, this is a huge sample size. Data came from two large MS research groups, the International Multiple Sclerosis Genetics Consortium and the Multiple MS Consortium. Disease worsening was based on expanded disability status scale scores with individual measures adjusted for age. And I've made a video, and you've probably already heard from your own doctors about EDSS. You've probably even been told what your score is and has been over the course of your disease. So this has to do with mainly walking and how much of an aid do you require to walk X distance. Do you need can you do it unassisted? Do you need a cane? Do you need a wheelchair, etc.? And of course your score is higher depending on what degree of an aid that you would need. Among 8,325 individuals who had EDSS scores documented at 3 or more time points, 5,565 from the discovery cohort and 2,760 from the replication cohort, a generalized linear mixed model analysis across all visits showed that DYSF-ZNF638 risk allele carriers had faster disability progression. An independent MS autopsy cohort of 290 brave individuals, hopefully they were already dead by then, showed that homozygous DYSF-ZNF638 risk allele carriers had a 1.8-fold higher number of lesions in the brainstem and a 1.76-fold higher rate of cortical lesions. So again, that is something that they could see on MRI, but it was a definite linkage with what they were finding with that genetic variation. The researchers also used Mendelian randomization to evaluate environmental effects and found that years of education, this to me is fascinating, years of education reduced the severity of MS, while smoking worsened it, further supporting the role of resilience. Hey, and you know, I've never smoked and I have more degrees than anyone really needs. And so I guess between those two things, maybe that's the reason that I've actually been doing pretty well with my MS course. I mean, I still have MS, let's not kid ourselves. It's not a fun thing to live with, but I feel like I've been quite stable over the last, I don't know, 20, 25 years. And maybe it's because I have focused much more on education, either formal education or just self-teaching. Even doing this channel, I think all the research that I've done for that and the reporting on it has kept my brain active. And maybe that's the kind of thing they're talking about for increasing resiliency. Factors associated with enhanced cerebral reserve capacity, including years of education, track with better patient outcomes, Burmell noted. The study had several limitations, the researchers noted. The EDSS has shortcomings, including its nonlinear nature. They acknowledged that, and factors like education and smoking are traits influenced by both genes and environment. Well, that's fair enough to say, but nonetheless, I still think this is pretty exciting. But let's go and take a quick look at the source of this MedPage article, which is this article in Nature, which again just came out. It was published on the 28th of June, 2023. And what I find interesting is the title. It's actually emphasizing something a little bit different from what was emphasized by the MedPage article. Locus for severity implicates central nervous system resilience in progression of multiple sclerosis. So while the MedPage article was focused on the genetics, this Nature article, at least the title of it, is focusing on the resilience of the central nervous system and how that affects progression. What I think is interesting is that's sort of intuitively obvious, right? The more resilient your nervous system is, the better you're going to do with multiple sclerosis. It makes total sense. But the neat thing is that we now have some actual scientific evidence for that. And since all you get with this is the abstract, there's really not a lot of point going through it. There's a lot more technical terminology because it's actually a science paper written for scientists. So I don't know that we need to go through it in detail. The main thing I wanted to show you was just the difference in the two titles and the fact that it's the same research, that the titles can kind of lead us down a path of how the report is received or what kinds of folks are interested in reading a certain paper based on the title. I have to say that the actual title in the Nature study is a lot more exciting to me than the other one. Even though the other one caught my attention, this one really does. Well, I hope you found that as interesting as I did. I know it's very sciencey. I know there's a lot of terminology in there. I tried to give you a little background, but there's always more. But this is an issue that we will be interested in keeping an eye on until we find out more. Because if there's one gene that's responsible for aspects of MS, there's bound to be others. And I'm going to be watching to see what else they come up with. But until then, and until my next video, take really good care of yourself. And we'll see each other again.